Hello and welcome back to OT, the podcast. We are here to talk about watches, time, and how to spend it. I'm Andy Green.
We're focusing on how to spend it today, really, aren't we?
We are. It's a spendy episode. We have Cameron Barr from Craft and Tailored.
Hang on. Let's stop this for a second. Do you know what I forgot to do? I forgot to say my name.
Who are you?
I could be anyone. The people listening won't know. My name is Martin Baker.
Martin Baker, welcome.
Hi, I'm the new host. I'm trying to make a Martin Baker pun now. No, it's Felix Schultz, of course. As you were.
Eject.
Back to it. Sorry.
Okay, Felix. In case you were worried that people didn't recognise your docile tones,
Dulcet.
Here we are. So we have Cameron Barr from Craft and Tailored joining us, but and the listeners can probably hear from the dynamic. We've caught up IRL.
Yeah,
and it was weird.
It was very weird. That's why, every so often, I don't know if this makes it on air. You make this joke fairly frequently that you're going to fire me as the co-host.
Yeah.
So those proceedings, look, we had to sign some paperwork in person, had some mediation. We thought we'd finally catch up and get those wheels in motion. One of us is going to be going soon. We'll have to.
We're not going to tell you who.
Maybe it's both. Maybe we've sold out. Maybe we've been bought by Google. No. Where we live in Melbourne has recently come out of its second lockdown, and there's a little bit more socialising allowed. So we thought we'd take the opportunity to catch up at a
bit of a team meeting.
Yes,
semi team,
little whip.
A little whip around. We've been busy. Anyway, we have been busy, and we had a bit of show and tell. Some watches I had bought, you hadn't seen IRL,
vice versa,
and you had some new stuff.
Yep.
So
I got to finally see the most famous Rolex on Instagram. The new, does it have a nickname yet, Andy? Your new 36mm OP in candy pink.
Yeah, I'm calling it the Cherry Blossom because that I got it the day that OT alumni James McVeigh's album came out, also called Cherry Blossom, and it's the same shade of pink. So I figured the timing was too good.
I saw another one. I think someone else called it to you. Candy green. Candy green.
Oh,
the candy green.
Candy green.
I like candy green.
Or Andy Pink. Did I change the Instagram handle?
No, I think candy green makes more sense as a pun because Andy is in candy.
But you can't spell candy without Andy.
Well, maybe you can if you have candy with an I. Let's talk about that in a while, though. I think you want to dive deep into the pros and cons of that. But that wasn't the only watch you had. You had another little fun boy, another colourful one as well. Actually, you had your Bamford. Is it Mayfair?
GMT.
Mayfair?
No, the GMT.
Okay, it's just called the GMT. Really cool case.
Yeah, so it's a really good size, really nice shape to it. Much slimmer in the metal, which is it's stainless steel, but it's grayed out as you might expect from someone like Bamford.
With a whole
bunch of orange sort of accents. So there's an inner bezel which has the GMT function, and that sort of half kind of really bright orange, and then there's sort of the orange GMT hand, and then a few other really nice touches. But I'll link.
Yeah, I want to take a second just to call out that actual case because you look at the pics, and I was expecting it to be a big chunky boy, but really,
no, not at all.
Quite small, quite slender, slips under the cuff, as they say.
Pretty true for 40 millimeters.
Yeah, really good case.
I had one other watch as well.
What'd you have? I can't even remember.
Helios.
Oh, Helios. How can I forget that? The sound of that bezel, it's just so smooth.
Very smooth. Very, very smooth. And you had a new watch I hadn't seen.
Yeah, and it was very... you do a side-by-side with the Helios, and they're like brothers from another cousin. The old Seiko... Can I remember the reference off the top of my head? SBP 149.
It's a Prospects.
Yep, it's a new sort of the 62 Master Diver that I mentioned a while ago. What did you think of that one?
That's cool. I snapped some photos and I didn't realize because of the lighting, we were sitting outside and it was quite bright, but I didn't take in the dial in full until I got home and kind of looked at some of the photos.
It's quite a cool dial. It's tricky to photograph, I think.
Yeah, it's got sort of chocolatey. I didn't even realize the sort of chocolately vintage vibes on it.
Jockey boy. Jockey gilt. And you also stole one of my watches.
I did. I stole your Anodyne. And I might not be giving it back.
Yeah. Now, once you go 36mm, you never go back. This is the Model 2, which is a 36mm as well. And what do you think of it on the wrist? Too big, too small?
No, it's great. I mean, I've just bought a 36 mil watch, so I'm right. It's right in my wheelhouse.
Mm,
I
mm.
love the dial. I love the case. Case is really cool. The hands are interesting. You don't see sort of a watch that looks like this that often,
It's like
and not
properly handmade. Like it doesn't.
mm,
Yeah, you can. There's no giant factories involved.
exactly, exactly. And you can't that handmade vibe does come across, but I really like it. It's got that sort of I don't know if it's like a mossy green enamel dial,
I believe they call
but
it. I think they might call it moss green. I don't know, but
moss green, moss
it's a
green.
lovely, lovely texture.
And I really like it. I mean, I still remember you wrote a review on it, and I sort of mentioned this today. You wrote a review like 12 or 16 or 18 months ago, a little while ago,
Mm,
sort of really introducing me to the brand,
mm,
and probably a lot of Aussies.
mm. I like to
It's just
think the
fascinating.
world. I
Probably the world.
broke the news of Anodyne.
You introducing Anordain as a brand that probably had been around for like 2 or 3 years at that point, but
Yep.
yeah, really cool brand, really really cool. It's really interesting. It's just something sort of different, and I like it. It stands out, that's for sure.
Sick price too. Like I mean, that's a not to rehash it too much. It's like a full enamel dial, manual amount movement. Little guys, and it's under 2K.
Wow.
And you can get those sort of fume. And yeah. Anyway, let's stop talking about Anodyne because I feel we might do that again in the future at some point. Let's have a break, and agree.
Let's do it, and we'll be back in a moment.
This episode of OT the podcast is brought to you by our sponsors, Longines. We've spoken a bit about their spirit line already, so today we thought we'd mix it up and have a look at one of their new heritage releases.
How wonderful. Which one today, Felix?
I thought we'd check out the Longines Heritage Military Marine Nationale.
Oh, very cool. I love this watch. I'll let you run through the details in a second, but this is one that just jumped out to me aesthetically, and I was hoping it would end up at my doorstep. I really dig that beige speckled dial, especially paired with those hands and the bold markers.
I get it, Andy. There's a lot to like. Let me break it down real quick. Steel case in a very vintage 38.5 millimeters across, that beige dial with the simple black Arabic numerals, and lovely blued hours, minutes, and second hands. It's an automatic movement, the L888.5. It's got a solid case back, decent 65 hours of power reserve, and the watch is rated to 30 meters of water resistance, all on a lovely brown leather strap.
I do love that size. And another nice touch is the dial text, which reads Fab Swiss, otherwise known as Swiss made. This is the one that was inspired by what's originally produced by the French Navy, right? After World War II.
Yeah, so that's where the Marine Nationale bit comes in.
Makes sense. Felix, what do you think of it?
It's a beauty. It's a great example of a straight up vintage design that doesn't beat you over the head with all the heritage stuff. You would be very happy if this was your only watch and you wore it every day. And while the whole package is neat, there's a few things that really stand out to me. We've talked about the dial, and it really is hard to go past. It's a creamy beige color, sort of like a rich old paper, and paired with those metallic blue hands, it really pops as a package. I also quite like the slightly oversized crown, as well as that double bezel that adds that goes really well with the case size and adds a surprisingly dressy feel to what is ostensibly a military watch. It's a lovely watch, and it's got no date window. Andy, you know what else I like about it though?
I think I'm about to find out.
Drilled lugs, baby.
Oh,
The strap is 19 millimeters across, which is something to consider if you want to, swap straps regularly. But I can't go past the retro touch of drilled lugs, and that makes changing the strap a cinch.
it's the quickest way to your heart, drilled lugs.
Yeah, 100.
Felix, hit me with the price.
You're looking at 3,050 Australian dollars with free shipping if you buy from Longines online, and across the board you get 24 months warranty.
Who do you think it's for?
If you're a vintage fiend, you'll love it. But like I said, it would make sense as a daily wearer for anyone if you had a bit of a retro bent. So if you like worn leather jackets, salvaged denim, Red Wings, all that sort of good stuff, this might be the one for you.
Very nice. All right, guys. So head to longines.com to discover the collection today and buy it if you like it. We'll link everything up. But Felix, we need to get back to the show.
We do. What are we doing now, Andy?
We're giving Cam Barr a call. He's in LA, as is his headquarters of Craft and Tailored.
The Sunshine State. Is that LA?
Sunny. We probably interrupted him driving somewhere in his 911.
Air-cooled Porsche.
Taking some film photography. And we're
Selling
going to talk
some
to him about vintage
Daytonas.
watches. We're going to talk about vintage watches. We're going to get his opinion on a few different, specific things. We're going to kind of get him to tell us about different price ranges and what he might recommend. But it's going to be good. It's going to
You
be
stop
interesting.
talking about it. Let's get him on. Let's let him do the
All
talking.
right, let's do it. Felix.
Andy Green, how are you?
Fantastic. We have very, very special guest on the line.
We do. It's Cam. It's Cameron Barr from Craft and Tailored. It's one of the cream of the crop of sort of vintage watch sites out there. So he's a great guy. Have you ever bought from him?
I have actually.
What did you get?
Vintage Tudor lollipop. I don't know. It was like 3 or 4 years ago now.
Oh,
Cam.
nice.
Yeah, I remember. It's a great watch.
Yeah, it was. It was very cool watch. Cam, great to have you on the line. How you going?
Yeah, good. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, guys. I'm so excited. I was thinking as I was driving into the office this morning, I'm like, oh, I'm so excited about this because like I've never met an Aussie that I didn't like, and that's the truth. Like, you guys are so fun. You guys are so chill. Like, I love it. And before the call, we were talking a little bit about the Australian watch scene, and I think it's so cool and it's so tight knit, and it's awesome. So I was like really excited about this because I'm like, yeah, I got to give my homies from down under a little bit of love, and I'm so excited that you reached out and asked to kind of have like a virtual hang because fan of what you guys are doing, and I've been following you on Instagram for a long time, and so really excited about this. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, not a problem.
Yeah, back at you, Cam, and we were getting pressured by the listeners to get you on. They wanted to sort of hear more of your story, which is, I guess, the starting point for the chat.
Sure.
Who are you, and how did you get into watches, and then obviously dealing watches?
Yeah, so I'm kind of just a normal guy, I guess, that has a deep obsession with watches. And what got me into watches is I was looking at things kind of differently. I'm a guy that loves living in the details, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that true exclusivity and luxury and all those kinds of things really, in many cases, isn't something that is noticeable, at least from my perspective, to a lot of people. It's really noticeable to me. The other thing that really attracted me to vintage watches is, when I started learning about them and really getting into the details and all that kind of stuff, I liked that everything was kind of like form meeting function, and it also facilitated a different type of experience for me tangibly. So when I would, put on a vintage watch or get into a vintage car or shoot with a camera, that really facilitated an experience for me. And having come out of the tech world, what was interesting about that is everything was so quick and everything had an expiration date, and there wasn't anything that was kind of built to last. And the feeling and kind of emotion in those things was very much kind of temporary. Whereas with these other things, it really, kind of changed the way that I felt about myself and in the time and place or wherever it was. So that's, I think, in essence, why I love these things and what really, kind of created this obsession with watches is the details and the variants, and having something that, maybe wasn't the most expensive or the most grandiose thing, but it was really special and really cool. And you were the only guy in that room or maybe in that county or in that state that had that watch, right? And that to me was exclusive and cool. So
Yeah, very cool, very cool. Well, I should ask. We don't normally do this, but you're a guest too. I think it's an interesting one to ask. What are you wearing on the wrist today?
you know what I'm wearing? It's a watch that I have not been able to take off. It's a Tudor Black Bay 58.
Oh, nice.
Wow, still you've been running that for quite a while.
Yeah, it's interesting because it kind of depends on what I'm doing. But this watch I think is really special, and I think you and I have had it. It's funny, Andy, is I think you had one really early on,
Yeah,
and I'm like, dude, that's such a cool watch. I want one, right? And we kind of had a chat about it,
yeah.
and then I had one, and somebody offered it in trade, and I kind of like did a little YouTube video on it and put it in the shop, and it like sold immediately, and I instantly missed the watch. I was like, oh. Like
Get this back.
I need one. Yeah. So, yeah, it's a fun watch. It kind of checks the vintage box for me, but it's also its own kind of thing. And I really like what Tudor as a brand is doing in the modern, sense. I mean, in front of me, I've got some incredible watches. I've got, a 6241 Paul Newman. I've got a gilt chapter ring 1675. I've got a matte dial 666 Sea Dweller. So I have that stuff in front of me, and I definitely will wear that stuff and kind of vibe with it. But yeah, my daily go-to has kind of been off and on this Tudor Black Bay 58, and that's the watch that I'm wearing today. So
Yeah, cool.
Very cool, very cool. I'm also wearing a Tudor, not a 58 today. It's a Tiger chronograph with a black dial that I
very cool.
that I picked up. It came on Friday, so I haven't taken that off.
Ooh,
Felix, you're probably not
you're
wearing a watch
I'm
right
not
now.
wearing a watch because I've been at home and I'm rarely wearing a watch. So I'm looking at 3 though, but that's okay. Cam, how long has Craft and Taylor been around, or how long?
yeah.
How long have you been in the business of sort of buying and selling watches?
Yeah, I've been. It was funny because I was thinking about this the other day. I was doing another like little segment. And what's weird about some of this stuff is like, with social media, I kind of just am who I am, and I put myself out there, and my reality, I think, is sometimes interesting for some people, because it's like people are like, are you really wearing a Paul Newman around, or are you really driving an air cooled 911? And I'm like, yeah, I'm actually sweating my balls off, like driving this 911 from Hollywood to downtown every day. Like, to some people that's crazy, but for me that's kind of normal. But Craft and Tailored has officially been in business for 4 years, coming up on 5.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this the other day, kind of during this little segment that I was doing, and I think I've been into watches for now coming up on like 13 or 14 years. So I've been kind of around it for a long time. I really
Sure.
wasn't doing anything in the professional capacity until about 4 years ago. But
Yeah.
I was kind of, like some guys, and like maybe some of the other dealers, the guys that have kind of dedicated themselves to this, started like helping other people out. And what really started Craft and Tailored is I would be in these places, and I was traveling around for a technology position, and my day kind of consisted of some variant of a meeting that revolved around food, because that's what you do. You have a business meeting, and you're like, oh, let's have a lunch meeting, let's have a dinner meeting, let's have a breakfast meeting, and you're like, it's kind of funny if you think about it that way. But I would have time in between these meetings, and I would be in all these different parts, and I would just go into like the pawn shops or stop into the jewelry store or whatever, and I would find these watches, and I'm like, oh my god, like that's a Meter's First 5513 Submariner, and it's way underpriced, and it has this awesome patina, and it's in the middle of Texas, and I can't just let it sit here. I have to buy it. And so I started kind of amassing this collection of watches, and the reality of this is that you start to collect things, and then you kind of, I think at some point, start to feel like a hoarder, where you're like, well, I've got 5 Meters First 5513s. There's only one that I'm really vibing with and really wearing, and I started to kind of feel guilty. So that's ultimately what led me to start kind of selling little pieces of my collection. And along the way, I was helping people. I would get back then like an email or text message, but not a DM or whatever. But I would get an email saying, hey, Cam, I know you know a lot about this. What do you think? And I would just kind of give my unbiased opinion on that watch, and that kind of turned into, I guess, a business. And so that's kind of the how long I've been started and why I've gotten started. Yeah.
So I was wondering, so in that time, either, since you've been, professional, but probably in the longer question of how long you've been, buying and selling, vintage watches actively, how's it changed, that sort of vintage watch scene in that time? What have you sort of observed?
I think, for me, the one thing that is interesting is I would be considered in the world of vintage watch dealers and watch dealers collectively, and maybe even collectors, is kind of like in some cases the new kid on the block, even though I've been doing this for a good amount of time. I think the thing that is interesting about our generation specifically is we, grew up with the internet, and we grew up with this access of information abundance, right? So it was like, if I was looking at something, I could like kind of go on my phone or look at at back then, like the message boards, which are still obviously very active today. And I could kind of like pull these comparables to like help myself acquire these things or make that informed decision based on an access of information. But even then, like, when I first got into this, I was reading a lot of books. I was looking at old auction catalogs. I was, inspecting things, meeting with a lot of people, and learning kind of in more of a traditional sense. Whereas today, I think, and this is kind of a double-edged sword, but I think that today, the information is out there. It's available. It's like mattdial5513.com. It's like, oh, here's the serial production range for a Mark 1 or a Mark 2 Maxi 5513. And this is how the curve in the S is supposed to be. And this is how the loom plot is supposed to sit, on the outer track. And, so that I think has changed, even for me a little bit, whereas like before it was like books and you were kind of like, at the mercy of that kind of stuff. And I think, the acceptance of all of these different mark variants and like subtle differences, and understanding the rarity in those nuances for some of these watches has definitely become much more apparent in the past, 5 to 10 years. Whereas before, I would geek out on that kind of stuff. And it was like, you'd walk into, that pawn shop or that estate store or like whatever. And it's like, oh yeah, this is, an old Submariner, right? Or if you were lucky, this is a 5513. Whereas today, it's like, oh, this is a Mark 1 Maxi, it's 5513 with the correct 93150 bracelet, and the date code matches on the inner clasp. And, so it's interesting that even like the seemingly kind of periphery dealer or the outside, kind of enthusiast knows that kind of stuff and is also paying attention to that. Whereas before, it kind of just didn't matter, or people just didn't have access or really care about that. It was like, oh, it's an old sub. Do you want it? It's 5,000. Like
yeah, sure, yeah, 100%.
We hear that a lot. That's and you mentioned double-edged sword, which I want to ask you about. But I think like the perfect example is the 666 Sea Dweller, which you mentioned you've got in front of you. Mark 1 matte dial. How do you feel about these sort of nuances and sort of the minutia that people get into? Like I agree with you on one hand, it's really an interesting point to kind of like rabbit hole on and kind of go down, the different marks of dials and against the different insert fonts and marks and that sort of thing. But we hear a little bit that this impacts the market because obviously purchasers are more educated, which is good, obviously, and the sellers are more educated. But do you think it's like led to this sort of crazy scenario of the same watch but a slight dial variation making it worth multiples?
I think there's and I think my answer to that would be yes and no. I think that I personally like that the consumer as a whole, and there's guys out there that are like me, because it validates my insanity for like looking at font and serial numbers and that kind of stuff. So it makes me feel a little bit normal, which is kind of funny. But I think that that the other side of that is that there are people that get like way caught up in the minutia of things. And yes, everything should be in alignment and correct and whatever. That's one part of it. That's kind of like the clinical scientific side. But also I've seen people like go after things and not really look at the generalized aesthetic of what it is that they're ultimately going after. And I think that that's a bummer because people lose the passion in the minutia. And I think it's trying to kind of find that balance. And so that's kind of what I mean by that. That's also a double-edged sword from the perspective of, people are like so overly consumed about this being a Mark 1 or a Mark 2 or Mark 3 or having the perfect fade but I always ask, I'm like, do you like this watch? Do you like it?
Yeah.
Hold it, hold it maybe, half a meter away from your face or whatever, hold it 36 inches out and look at it. And does this watch speak to you? Because, at the end of the day, all of those other things definitely matter, but does it also speak to you? Do you like it? Right. And I think that is something that is important for me. I will get into a watch and, loop it at 15x and hit it with ultraviolet and validate that watch is authentic and period correct and all that kind of stuff. But also at the same time, there's watches that come across my desk that I'm just like, yeah, it's correct. Yeah, it's a good deal, but there's just no soul and energy in this. And it in many cases will be a pass, even if there's like, an upside potential for our acquisition of that watch, because, I really want to acquire and ultimately curate things for the greater watch community that has kind of like that special excitement in it, and so.
Yeah, definitely. We'll get to those exciting pieces because we've been perusing the store and there's a few that we've pulled out to hero later on.
Yeah.
Felix and I were discussing this, and we're kind of wondering, in your opinion, sort of having been around the traps for a while now, what's the most sort of vintage, the sought after vintage piece at the moment? What's the piece
You
to
know,
have?
it's kind of interesting. I think that, and there's a really fun guy. I'm going to give a shout out to ID Guy on
Oh,
YouTube.
yep.
We did a fun like little collaboration together, and the whole premise of the thing was talking about like Grail watches, and I think that there's like that stereotypical Grail for most guys out there or gals, right? Where it's like you need like the Paul Newman is the Grail, or the Nina Rint is the Grail, or the double red sea dweller with a Mark One or Mark Two brown dial is the Grail. But I think what's fun is like I think the Grail is different to everybody,
Hmm.
and that's also what's fun for me is like I can see like the magic in something, and when that other person comes to the online shop or comes to our showroom and they also see it, like that's really exciting for me, and that's how my passion has stayed alive, because I've seen kind of, I mean, not gloating here, but I've seen a lot of stuff. I've seen a good number of Paul Newmans. I've seen big crowns. I've seen a lot of that incredible stuff, and after a while you're like, well, okay, it's a Paul Newman, right? Like you work with that kind of customer base or that subset of collectors, and we're always kind of dealing in that rarefied air, so to speak. But when somebody sees it for the first time, or when you again get into those little details and nuances, I think it's there. I would say, to answer your question more specifically, Andy, I think the neo vintage watches are really something that I've seen a lot of activity and movement in. I think they're birthier watches for some guys, which to some people is very important. But those watches out of the later part of the 1980s into the 1990s, I think that there's still a lot of bang for buck in watches like that. Sapphire kind of transitional watches, maybe like a 666, or maybe like the later 5513s with the glossy dial with the white gold surrounds. I've seen a lot of activity on those. There's things that I think have cooled off a little bit that are kind of interesting, like Omega Speedmasters out of the mid 1970s. I think those are cooling a little bit. Double red sea dwellers, I think, have cooled down a little bit. I'm not getting as many phone calls for people having me try to validate and source those watches for them, and even though they're out there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Andy, could we just take a break? I need a refill.
What are you drinking, Felix?
It's your classic filter roast from our new coffee sponsor, Inglewood Coffee Roasters.
Beverage sponsor, Felix. We have made it.
I've got a cheeky Yirgacheffe filter on the go at the moment. Ethiopian bean with some light floral notes. It's my daily, and I can't get enough.
Well, Felix, I'm actually punching out another double espresso using their Colombian Spirit of Peace espresso roast blend. It's sweet and biscuity.
So here's the deal. Use OT30, that's OT30, for 30% off your order at checkout. On top of that, Inglewood Coffee Roasters offer free shipping on all Victorian orders and Australia-wide when you spend more than $50.
Head to inglewoodcoffeeroasters.com.au to place an order today. We'll link that up. OT the podcast, fueled by Inglewood Coffee Roasters.
Let's get back to it. So I guess my thing is, like, what you've spoken is sort of about, that I guess stereotypical Grail list, and it's a handful of vintage watches, and that's, I think, reflective of the market, obviously. But I'm really interested in, from your perspective as someone, and I 100% hear what you're saying about, oh yeah, that's a Daytona. It's fundamentally a fairly mass-produced object, and it's become something special through time and all that sort of stuff, but it doesn't make it a exceptional watch necessarily. What are those watches that you see that you go, man, this is a really great watch? Why aren't more people going crazy over this?
I have a watch in the shop right now that I think is maybe a Grail for some people, but it's a Universal Genève reference 885103/02, and not to get too nerdy, but essentially it's a Compax Nina Rint.
Yep.
And the Rint, I think, is a Grail for some people, but if you look at like a Rint versus, like, let's say a Paul Newman, I think that there's even more exclusivity and more design detail in something maybe less pop cultural desirable, like a Nina Rint. And I'm like, why isn't this watch like 60 grand? It's sitting in the 30s. And granted, these watches have grown, but if you really look at the details of the dial, there are elements to this watch from a horological perspective that I think make it really unique, really special, and in some cases even like more rare than like a Newman. It just
100%.
didn't have that like pop culture status, and I don't know if it ever will. I think that there's a subset of collectors that really get it. And that's like the funny thing about kind of doing this. Like, I'm still learning. My passion is still growing. I'm still looking at things, and my taste is always kind of developing and evolving. And I think that that's ultimately the fun thing about vintage watches as a whole. I don't really drink, but I can, I guess, kind of compare this almost to like maybe somebody that collects wine is an aficionado with wine, because if you have like a Cabernet that is, from, like it's like a $2 chuck versus like a Bordeaux from like the 1950s that has complexity and whatever in it, in order to really appreciate that like expensive, robust, diverse bottle of wine from, let's say, like the 50s or whatever, you kind of have to start with that $2 chuck and kind of like develop that perspective and experience and kind of develop a palate for it. And so I think that that's the fun thing about this too, is like, I think there's watches out there that are still kind of sleepy that, people are ultimately maybe just discovering, even guys like me that have quote unquote kind of seen it all, that are still kind of like magical, you know what I mean? Like, taste is evolving and people are kind of becoming more woke, if that makes sense, to certain references.
I like the sleepy comment. So just to dig a little deeper, because I think if I think of the sleeper or the undervalued, underappreciated watch, sort of from the early days when I got into it, it was always the Rolex Explorer 2s. You could for a long time there, you could get a full set, really nice condition, for like $4,000, and then it was, geez, he's gone up to $5,000, he's gone up to $6,000, and now it's sort of they've basically doubled in probably the last 5 years, and that was like a classic case of, if you objectively look at it and its peers, this is something that's underappreciated. So I'd love to hear if there are any pieces that you're kind of starting to see, or you that come across your desk over and over again, and it could be like an old Seiko or something, where it's just like the second you get it in, it sells because the collectors, like, they appreciate what it is, and it's rare and it's special, and it gets snapped up, but I guess the market price hasn't come up to sort of reflect that demand.
Yeah, I think that you're referencing a 16570, right? Like an Explorer 2. Yeah, I mean that watch was like a big head scratcher for me, because if you looked at like a 16710, so a GMT from the same era, like a GMT Master 2 that had the same exact movement, and ultimately, I mean, it is the same watch, right? The 16570 featured a caliber 3185, and then later the 3186, which offered like that jumping hour hand. I think that like is incredible, and I was like, why are these watches trading at like $4,000 when the GMT is, with a Pepsi bezel or a Coke bezel or whatever, is trading for like almost double? Like, that doesn't make sense to me, right? That's gonna like catch up. I think that there's for sure stuff out there like that, and I think that's a perfect example of that, because the 16570s are trading in, like I mean, you can still find a good deal on them, but in US dollars, they're like 7,500 for a good one. And they're kind of hard to find now too. So I think that people are, again, waking up. I think that there's, really good value in maybe some of like the Wakeman chronographs, Galets, watches that are using like Valjoux 72 movements that are, again, maybe just not like that top tier brand, like, a Rolex or whatever. Like, I've got a really incredible Croton Aviator Sea Diver chronograph right now that is like really cool. And, there's a lot of history. It uses a Landeron 248 movement. Like, it's kind of a banger of a watch, but it's $1,700. Like, no, like, if you really look at that watch and look at other, watches out of that era, like, this watch is under $2,000, and it packs a big punch. Another watch that has been kind of interesting is like the Watchco Seamaster 300s.
Yeah,
holy crap, I can't find those watches fast enough. I can't keep them in stock. we did a little thing which was kind of like a fun experiment, but also something that has created a little bit of a headache for us humorously, which was created a wait list on Watchco Seamaster 300s for like the 166 and the 165.024s. I have like 14 people on a Watchco waiting list, and like that's kind of like a weird watch, you know. It's kind of like, I would say like it's not really an homage watch. It's kind of its own thing because it uses genuine Omega service, you know, components.
Yeah.
But like people are like really waking up to a watch like that. You used to be able to buy those watches for like 2,000 US, and now I can't buy them for like under 5, you know? So
Are they Aussie? Watchco's an Aussie.
yeah.
Yeah,
The
that's
story behind it's really cool.
Yeah, I know the guy. Yeah, that's fascinating because when I started, they were like under $1,000 here if they were average ones.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yep. And they're cool because, like, you know, it's all genuine Omega service parts. And it's kind of a watch that's kind of like on the outside of like the true vintage circle. But it's a watch that I think is like fun because, you know, if you look at what's happening in the modern watch community, you know, Rolex, I think, is struggling to like create product that is relevant to somebody who is into the design details and into the history of its product. And same thing with like a Breitling or, you know, any other top tier brand. And so it's like, it's almost like if Omega were to like look back into the archive and like create a watch that would appeal to the guy who wants something that he can wear, but has that like vintage yet modern, you know, technical kind of functionality, it would be a Watchco Seamaster 300, you know?
Yeah, 100%. So there's something you sort of mentioned a little while ago, and it was, you know, talking about Watchco and sort of value. That's got me thinking about, was it Bonhams that listed an auction recently that was an all Seiko collection, and it sort of, there was a bit of up and down as to the catalog, and that sort of got me, you know, again, that's a brand that the right vintage references have, you know, sort of gone up exponentially, albeit, you know, still a fairly reasonable price. Do you think that we're going to see the right models from Seiko sort of start exploding, like, say, you know, that the classic era Hoya has in the last 5 or 10 years? Are we going to see that with the Japanese watches?
I think we're seeing it now. Yeah. I mean, we love Seiko watches at Craft and Tailored. And part of the reason for that is because I love Seiko watches. I mean, I'll be wearing like my Tudor, you know, modern, you know, diver to a, you know, Hoyer or whatever. Right. And then I'll pull out like a 6139, 6005, like Pogue, for example.
Yeah.
And like I get as much enjoyment wearing that Pogue or like you know, a Captain Willard or my Turtle or like a World Time as I do in something that is like 2,000 times as expensive, you know? So I think we're seeing that. And I think that the collector market is also realizing that. And I also think that, you know, again, with like social media and Instagram and also understanding like the history behind the stuff and really defining what the substance of this subject matter is, I think people are kind of waking up to that and realizing that like the 6139 reference, there's a ton of cool watches in there that aren't expensive and they're accessible and they're just as cool as, let's say, like a vintage sub out of the 60s or something like that. So
love it.
Yeah, I mean, in Grand Seiko too, like the vintage Grand Seiko stuff is like really popping. Like Grand Seiko, I think in the past like couple of years has really made a good comeback and like marketing their pieces and doing some stuff from a horological complexity perspective, meaning like, you know, doing stuff with like spring drive and like just interesting stuff from a horological innovation perspective, but also from a design perspective, they've captivated the market. And I think that is also drawing people into like the earlier Grand Seikos out of like the 80s and the late 70s and the 90s and stuff too. So I've seen a lot of movement with the Seikos. And like, you know, one of my favorite watches of all time is the 6309 7040. And like, I love that reference range of watches. I have one in my personal collection that I wear all the time. And those watches are definitely in demand. Like you used to be able to get those watches, like the 6309 series of watches for like, you know, like a couple $100. And now you can find a crap one on eBay for like $2,000. So I definitely think there's validity to what it is that you're saying there, and I think we're seeing that for sure.
And just a quick follow-up. I know Andy's got something he sort of wants to get onto. Do you think with stuff like Seiko that was fundamentally a pretty accessible, low-price sort of product when it came out, is there a cap on where it will go in terms of price, or is that really anyone's guess and up to the market?
Is your question more like from like an investment perspective, where
Yeah.
it's like, is this
Like,
is
like,
is like
well,
a 6105 going to be $5,000 one day?
yeah, like, or if you get the right, minty looking Pogue, is that like going to be big money in 5 years' time, or is that too far out to tell?
I don't have a crystal ball, and I think this is just my general take on it. I think that there is limitations with some of these things, and I think what ultimately limits them is, the total number of units produced. Do I think like a Captain Willard could break $5,000 to $6,000? I think so. I think that we'll see that. Do I think it's going to break 25 to 30,000? No, because it's a Seiko, and the number of them produced is a lot more than, let's say, like a gilt Submariner from the early 1960s, right? And so I think that there is a cap. What is the cap? I don't know, but I think that these watches are becoming more and more desirable as a result of increasing awareness and cult-like following. And I think that the guys that are ultimately buying these watches, myself included, there's watches that I buy and I just keep them. And so those watches are being bought out of the pre-owned market, and then they're going into those collections, and then they're ultimately sitting in those collections. And I think that the simple economics is you have an increasing awareness of these things. You have sub-segment within the community, like Instagram, and people that are like sub-segment fans of a specific reference or a specific brand. And then you have a community that's buying the watches and then limiting the supply because of an increasing demand. I think that inevitably the pricing and desirability of those things is for sure going to go up. But I think to your main question, I think that there is definitely a cap, because a Seiko is always going to be a Seiko, and Rolex is always going to be a Rolex. And I think that those two brands have done a different job of marketing themselves and have different pop culture and kind of different associated desirability with them because of just who they are in the world of watches and luxury goods and all that kind of stuff.
If only Paul Newman wore a Seiko.
He probably
he wore some other cool watches. Yeah.
He probably did. All right, Cam. Before we get on to some tips for buying vintage, I want to hear what in your opinion is the best vintage watch. Sort of 5 to 10K. That can be USD. What's the best one to grab?
5 to 10K USD. I would say if you're looking for, and do you want to talk about like Rolex or Omega or just all brands?
Yeah, all brands. What's your pick?
I really like watches that are less is more.
Yep.
I like the 14270 Explorer. Those are a watch that I think have a lot of room to grow. People are definitely paying attention to them, and that's for the non watch reference nerds like myself and you guys probably. But that's the Explorer 1 with the white gold surrounds. So I think that there's some growth and room to grow in those, and I've seen some room there, and they're also accessible. I like a lot of the neo vintage watches in that range. So like Rolex sport watches out of, let's say, the later part of the 1980s into the 1990s that still possess tritium luminous material on the dial, but are glossy and kind of possess a modern feature set while still being a little bit more on the vintage side. We see lower production numbers there, and those watches offer, I think, a lot of bang for their buck in terms of like wearability, but also classic styling and iconic nature. So I'd say that. I would definitely say, Seikos, that's probably going to be sub $5,000 in most cases, but I think that, like Captain Willard's or 62 Moss, the early vintage Seiko sports watches, I think are really a great place to start. And then you have, kind of the outlier 60s like chronographs like Croton or even in some cases like Universal Genève or, Movado has some really amazing watches.
Yeah.
Doxas are cool, that kind of stuff. In the vintage category too, I would say that in the $5,000 to $10,000 range, I think there's a lot of watches in the vintage like Tudor Submariner range. I know that Amy, before we kind of jumped into the call, we were talking about that, but I think there's a lot of like really good bang for buck, like in the 79090. So like the
Mm-hmm.
Tudor Submariner from the 1990s. Big blocks are also a great place to start. Like reference 79160. It's basically like a little mini 6263 with a date complication and an automatic movement. Those are super cool. I know you get it because you're wearing a Tudor, Tiger,
Tiger.
which is
Yeah. I'll
awesome.
type those up
I mean,
as
it's
well. Yeah, they're going to double in value.
Yeah, get them while you can.
Oh, it's
yeah.
a funny watch, funny reference. Well, I think by now everyone's going to be really interested in exploring vintage watches. It can be a pretty prickly place to dive into. I think the 5 to 10K range makes sense because a lot of people, that's where they sort of dip their toes in buying something a little bit older. But in terms of sort of call it a vintage watch buying guide, what sort of would you recommend to someone who's never really bought, whether it's a vintage Submariner or a vintage Seiko or a vintage Omega? What would you recommend they kind of follow when they're shopping online or in person?
One of the things that I really still love doing is just talking with people about watches, and so my first piece of advice would be, ask a lot of questions, get additional pictures, maybe even go onto the forums. I'm sure you guys get questions all the time like, hey, what do you think about this? And generally speaking, the community isn't really that stodgy or standoffish. Like if somebody has a question for me, um, I'm kind of bumping around, and it's hard for me to, chase stuff down and run the business side while also answering questions. But I still do a lot of that, and I try to get to every email. And so my first bit of advice would be ask a lot of questions. Like the reason why the dealers are out there is in most cases is not to just like pull the wool over your eyes. I know that can be scary, but do your due diligence, ask around, poke around. Like the good guys are the good guys for a reason. And there's a good number of us out there. And generally speaking, we're willing to help. And in many cases too, I have guys and I welcome this, that will send me like a picture of a watch on Chrono 24 from a dealer that I may or may not know, but they're just asking for my opinion on it. And I'll give them, that advice. If it's a good deal, it's a good deal. I'll tell you to buy it, right? I'm not going to like poo-poo a watch just because it's not in my collection or whatever. And so I would say ask questions, get a second opinion. And what I think you'll also find too is like, I'm a guy that knows a lot about a lot. And also I'm still learning, but there are also guys that I reference to, even as a dealer, to say, hey, look, I'm an expert in this, and I think that this is correct, but all you do is look at like Audemars Piguet 5402s, right? Like, or Movado Datron pilots, and that's like that dude on Instagram is like the expert in that stuff. And I'll from time to time reach out and say, hey, what do you think of this? So I would say ask a lot of questions, and then also do your due diligence. The magical thing about the internet is you can really look into who it is that you're buying and selling from. Just do a Google search, right? Like for us, there's a lot of people that have like written about their experiences, which I like, but it's a two-way street, right? Sometimes I'll like Google the guy that we're potentially going to be doing business with, and I kind of want to know who it is that I'm sending a watch to, and I want to make sure that his wire clears and like that kind of stuff. So I would say leverage the internet. And the other thing I would say on that is we were talking about this in the beginning. You know, uh, the internet being a double-edged sword. There's a lot of guys that are just like keyboard warriors that don't really have actual experience with the subject matter. It's like, I guess now I'm referred to as a Paul Newman expert, and I think that there's some validity to that because I've looked at a crap ton of Paul Newmans. Like I have a lot of experience with that subject matter, and I've spent hours and hours and hours looking at like font details and the step in a dial and the luminous material composition and that kind of stuff. Whereas like, there's some guys out there that are just like, oh, that's a crap watch, or this is BS or whatever. And then you really peel back the layer of the onion and you're like, wait, man, have you ever seen a Paul Newman before? Or have you ever, wait a minute, I don't know if your opinion is valid or reputable, because like, to me, it doesn't look like you've actually spent time with this stuff. And So I think, that's the other side, and that's where things get a little bit tricky. Is that, sometimes the power of the internet works in the other way, where there's like a billion people that have an opinion on something, but they don't really have any experience with the subject matter themselves, and that's where things can get a little bit, dicey. So
Yeah, definitely, definitely. That's all, really good advice. I've bought a few pieces, and I can kind of echo those sentiments. Questions, I found that, if someone doesn't want to answer questions, either it's sort of out of arrogance because they sort of think that they shouldn't have to answer them, or there's something going on. And I think that even, yeah, you're right. Asking questions and asking for a little bit more details, asking for case back pictures and movement pictures, it's that extra layer. And when you're talking 5-6 figures, you've got to be doing it. You kind of got to just really kind of unearth everything and get that conversation going, because it's not meant to be the sort of thing that you kind of just like click and buy, and you don't have some sort of interaction with. So that's really good advice. We've talked about Rolex a little bit, and this is one that we've earmarked to ask you. Felix and I kind of talk about this a lot, and I don't think well, maybe we've answered it already, but in terms of vintage Rolex specifically, we hear Oyster Quartz a lot as being the most underrated vintage Rolex on the market, and you know that's interesting because things like hype aren't exclusive to modern watches, as you've talked around. Paul Newman's Felix mentioned the sort of the period that vintage Hoya had, where it was going crazy for a while there, and then it sort of softened and came back down. But I'm keen to hear what you think the hypiest vintage piece on the market is at the moment.
Hypeest vintage piece. I think Oyster Quartz is kind of cool because, if you really peel back the layers of the onion around, that time in what we'll call like watchmaking history or horological history, essentially Seiko released the quartz movement, and it sent the, Swiss watchmaking world into like a panic, because the quartz movement ultimately could be, created quite cost effectively and still to this day. And ultimately, it's also very accurate. So when you were looking at timekeeping in that frame of time, it wasn't just about like having something that was complicated, but it also was about creating timepieces that actually told very accurate time. And so I think that that's a really good like starting point. Like I think the Beta 21 movement as a whole and the story behind that and some of the watches that came out of that era in time are really cool. I think Oyster Quartz is cool. I also think that and I like them a lot. I've had Oyster Quartz date aids. I've had Oyster Quartz date justs. They're interesting because very accurate movements, much more mechanical than your stereotypical like tiny quartz circuit and the movement. And then you also saw like the house is really pushing the design boundaries. You have Rolex, who created this kind of like geometrical style case that was almost more similar to like Audemars Piguet or like a Nautilus, and was like a deviation away from like their kind of standard Oyster style case. And some incredible watches came out of that. I think there's hype there. I think there's always going to be hype around like Paul Newman's and Subs and those kinds of watches, because they really are icons of design. And there's also that pop culture that surrounds them as well. I would say, the Genta designs have been very strong over the past couple of years. And I think you're also seeing that as a result of like, Patek really, the flagship model right now with Patek, and I think for here on out is really going to be the Nautilus. And I think that has driven awareness to the kind of the forefather watches, which are like the 3700 series with Patek, with Audemars Piguet. I think, you have like the 5402s, which are also stemming from like the Royal Oak kind of rising in pop culture and in design standards. So I think I see those watches, as being kind of hot watches on the vintage side. But I think that there's a lastingness to that, especially considering that I think the vintage watch market is still very strong, and we are in like a global pandemic. I can't think of a worse time to like be in from any perspective, right? Especially here in the US, we've got a lot of political turmoil. We have like a lot of like social and cultural change that's just happening in the world right now. And the watch market is still very strong. Like they're not making any more of these things, and they're not ever going to make them again. Rolex isn't going to make a Paul Newman Daytona throwback, right? Universal Genève is not going to start making rints again. Heuer is not going to be making, the Carrera series of watches with mechanical movements. I don't think that those companies are based to do that. So I think that vintage in general, and especially around some of the more iconic models and some of kind of the staples of design, will remain strong, just because of what those things are.
Just quickly on that, on the sort of impact of COVID-19, it's not something we like to really bring up too often on the show, but it is inevitable, and I think for the impacts that the pandemic is having on this particular interesting industry has been really interesting, as you say. Why is it that do you think that the market for pre-owned watches, new watches, vintage watches has sort of been not really affected by COVID-19 because, global recessions, economic turmoil, political turmoil on a global scale, and yet this, I guess, call it an asset class, seems to be, pretty stable, which you wouldn't expect given sort of the confidence that people have in other things. But do you have any insights? Do you hear anything from your customers? Do they mention why they're sort of happy to still spend money on watches?
Yeah, I think you mentioned something there, and this is something that is, again, kind of an interesting topic for me, is watches being realized as asset classes. And I think that there was a transition that happened maybe, I want to say in the past like 10 years, that the greater market as a whole is now realizing watches as almost pieces of art, right, of functional design. And I think the same thing can be said for like, vintage cars and those kinds of things too, that there's more to these things than them just being like a commoditized good that is produced in mass. And so I think that part of the reason for that stability factor in some cases, or in many cases, is that these things are being realized and appreciated as pieces of art, and I think that is what is driving maybe some of the stability into the market. I think the other thing, and we've kind of touched a little bit on this, and obviously for anybody that's listening to this as a podcast, or that follows you or me or anybody that's in the watch community on Instagram, that is that access of information and that community in subset is much more defined today than it once was. So the collector, the enthusiast, the car guy, you were like driving up and meeting a guy who had, let's say, like a Porsche at the gas station and sharing that passion together. Whereas today, it's very easy to connect with a group of like-minded people. And I think COVID-19 in many ways has brought the communities closer together, because simply people are just in front of their screens, and people are also coming up with creative ways to like talk about the things that they love and kind of create community.
Fascinating.
I think if anything, it's driven people more closer together than spread them apart. The one bummer is that, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think the one thing that is kind of a bummer is like, I really like meeting with people, and I've had some like incredible watch hangs like all over the world, Hong Kong, London. I've met people that I've conversed with like over the internet. But the cool thing to that is that we never would have met each other had it not been for like the app or the social media platform or the internet to begin with. So I think that's kind of the funny part about that, is like, I'm bummed that I'm not able to travel and kind of like hang with the greater community in person, because of COVID-19. But I think to answer that question and to shed some of my own personal perspective on it, I think if anything, it's driven people closer together because, like, we don't have any.
Yeah. Great answer. And I think what I find really interesting with that is, so we can all agree that sort of vintage pieces are somewhat of an asset class. When you sort of say that people appreciate them as art, that sort of adds another layer of enjoyment, and you kind of go, well, maybe it might go down, but I can still look at it and it's still pretty and it still gives me enjoyment. And then the third sort of thing, that the fact that you can actually wear it and there's utility to it. So it's this sort of wearable art that you can then really fall back on and say, well, I can treat it like I would a normal watch and just enjoy it and actually wear it. That to me is pretty cool, and potentially that's why it's sort of, there's been some stability there, because there's so many layers to it. But Felix, I know you had a question.
Yeah, just a quick one. So you were talking about, sort of what's popping in the vintage Rolex, radar. Do you think with the releases from Rolex, just this past week at time of recording, are we going to see a run on, those sort of beautiful stellar dialed Rolex models?
What's funny about that is I would, and again, this is just a guess at my point.
Sure.
But I would say probably, and the reason why is because I think you have a much more commercial awareness of where that design inspiration may have come from, right? And so you kind of saw that happen with the reintroduction of like the new Daytona, the ceramic Daytona, because there was a lot of like industry heads and like people that were serious collectors and quote unquote influencers or whatever you want to call them, that was like, oh, this new Daytona kind of looks like the 6263. And then there were people that were going like, well, wait a minute, what's a 6263? And that would kind of drive them towards the vintage or the original example. In had that not happened,
Yeah.
I don't think that those people maybe would have been that aware or had interest in maybe the original version of something that was modern and captivated their attention. So I think so.
Cool.
I think that I think we'll probably see an increased awareness around Stella dials, and maybe people on the outside of maybe not the vintage community go, wait a minute, what's a Stella dial? Matter of fact, there's probably a guy who's going to be listening to this that doesn't know what a Stella dial is.
Yep.
He's Googling it, right? Like, what's a Stella dial, right? So
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have been doing that over the last week. There's been a lot of chatter about those colors. So
yeah,
so many references. I'll just open up a phone book and hyperlink it.
Felix, I'm happy to help if you need to. I know, like, sometimes I live in like,
just
the
a pain.
This week's show notes brought to you by Crafted Tailored. All right, speaking of, I've actually jumped onto craftedtailored.com because it's a website I know I genuinely, I've bought from, but I also like to hop on and just have a look at and a window shop at the wacky sort of pieces that that you put on the site. And an hour into the chat nearly, it's pretty obvious that you're a character amongst dealers, and you like the quirk and you like the funky stuff. And I regularly send Felix just wacky stuff, and some examples. The dinosaur fossil dial Rolex day date that we talked about.
Yeah.
I'm looking at a gold Ikepod. I'm looking at string dial day date, like factory string dial day dates. What else jumped out? There was a Beta 21 Patek, which is super rare, super quirky. And then at the same time, these more sort of entry level pieces, like old Seiko chronographs, like old Seiko mono pushers, like old, there's a Tudor Advisor, Felix, that I sent you the other week there for sale. Well, this is the 1982 model, and it's sort of even like old Bulova, and it's $1,800. And I look at that and I go, the passion is there because these are a lot of pieces that a lot of other dealers would say too hard basket. And my question to you is, how do you balance the need that you obviously have to, bring variety into your business with the need to, profit on these watches? And, profit isn't just, making your margin, but it's also this, turning something over in a relatively quick period. Because if you wanted to do your 10% on every model, you would just get in sports Rolex, but you're not doing that. You've got a full set, Ikepod for $12,500 US. Yeah. So how do you balance that? How do you say, sit down, watch collector? The businessman needs to make some money.
It's just like, and that's kind of the funny thing. How do you keep the lights on, right? I think what's interesting about this, and part of the value of my insanity, so to speak, is that in some cases I can see things that have value in them from a monetary perspective that might be just like literally on the surface of the earth, right? So it's like I'm walking down the street and I'm like aware of like what's out there, and I'm like finding like these little gold nuggets that are out there, like on the surface of the earth. And that's kind of the strategic advantage that I have of being obsessed and staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning and looking at like, the font characteristic of a Mark 1, 16520 Zenith Daytona bezel, right? Versus one that might be later or not genuine or whatever. So like in essence, that's how I'm able to essentially pull and generate a profit. The reality is I'm not finding Paul Newman's, in some back alley in an underground watch dealer network for $5,000. Yeah, that just doesn't exist, right? But there is value in being able to determine what is good and what is exceptional and what is really, really exceptional, and being able to validate those things and then curate that to bring that to the market as a whole. Because the average person or the average collector is not going to, like me, hop on an airplane, fly halfway across the world to go grab a watch, or is able to determine if a case is truly unpolished or not, or if the luminous material on the dial is correct and of the right patina spec and blah 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 blah. Right? I can wax on about that forever, but and so I think that's the ultimate value that I bring, is like being able to look at some of these things and go, okay, this is good and this is special and this is what kind of fits within that market threshold. I think the other thing too is, if you look at the collection, I like watches. Like, I really like just interesting and cool stuff. Sure, I love like 5513s or Pepsi GMTs and stuff like that. But I think that there's what keeps my passion alive is like this the Patek 3597, for example, the Beta 21. Like, when I pick up that watch, one, it represents a very specific place and time for Patek. One of the most fine, well-regarded, one of the watchmakers of the Holy Trinity, right? Meaning, like, they focused on movement and fineness and detail, and they were kind of in this like quartz crisis. They created like this insane reference where, like, I hold this thing in my hand and I'm like, holy crap, like, this for sure is a work of art. The bracelet is just insane. Like, wearing that watch, it just, again, brings out like this crazy feeling and changes the way that I view myself within the world. And same thing with like the Seikos. Like, sometimes I'll find like cool little like Seikos where, in some cases it's like the watch is so cool, like I just have to share it with the world, and I just want to wear it for a little while, right? And not be a hoarder, and I put it on the site and it eventually sells, and I got to enjoy it for a minute, So, yeah.
Yeah, and is that like, just to sort of bring it back full circle, is that what sort of Craft and Tailored is about? Like, it's a mix of the, I guess, where would you put that mix of the real bread and butter vintage and that sort of elevating the art or elevating the conversation around vintage watches? How would you sort of put that balance down as a business?
I think what's cool about like the true real deal, like OG, as they say, the original gangster collectors, is that the real collectors are into other stuff that is not like $500,000. Like, if you really peel back the layers of the onion with the true core collecting community, the guy that has like the 6263 Panda Paul Newman, that's a $1.3 million watch, he's probably also going to have like a Seamaster 300. He's going to have Seikos. He's going to have some Hoyers. Like, the real deal collectors, based on my experience, the taste is vast and varied, and everybody kind of at that level appreciates things that could be seemingly simple and or kind of like more utilitarian, right? And so like that I think is something that you see in the collection that we curate as well. And I think that the fun thing about this is, like, no doubt we deal with some very powerful, important, like 1% of 1% kind of people. If you're spending $1 million on a Newman, or a couple $100,000 on a vintage Rolex reference or a Patek reference or whatever, you have to have some financial wherewithal. But also at the same time, like, I also like talking with a guy about a mono pusher Seiko, or an interesting Grand Seiko, or a cool vibey Tudor. There's just as much enjoyment in that to me, and I think relevance in today's kind of holistic watch market in those pieces as there are like only selling like fossil dial day dates or lapis dial day dates or whatever, right? And the other thing too is, like,
he's the man to go to. He's the man to go to for the lapis dial and the fossil dial.
Cool.
It's such a funky watch, and we talked about that early in the OT days. A fossil dial came up, and honestly, I didn't even know that one existed. And Felix schooled me on dinosaur dials.
You thought I was making it up,
and then you had. I was like, "You're kidding me!" And that to me is sort of the beauty of the vintage stuff, is you get to look back on the history, and it's sort of why I love this Tiger that I'm wearing today as an example, because it's 1998. But you look back on the history, and it was there was a time where they, like, Tudor did a watch basically in collaboration with Tiger Woods, but printed Tiger on the dial of a whole bunch of watches. They're out there, they exist, and like it's just part of the history. And to me, that is super quirky, super funny, super interesting, and that's why I love it. So I think vintage is a really great place for people to learn about the current and appreciate the current even more. And it's also, when you're looking around and your mates all have the same watches, it's a great place to kind of go and get something that's a little bit, there's more effort required. It's harder to get. Not everyone's going to have a Lapis style or you know, an Aquadive 1000 Caribbean, triple safe. Like, and this stuff, it doesn't have to be super expensive. So I think I encourage all the listeners to sort of check that stuff out. But enough watch talk. We all love watches. You love you love cars. You love Leicas. What are you driving at the moment, and what are you shooting on?
I'm actually shooting on a couple of different things, and what's, again, kind of, I think, to maybe some people this might seem just like totally ridiculous and kind of out there, but I've been shooting a lot of 35 millimeter film every day. I shoot my
Cool.
go-to camera on the digital side is a Leica M240. It's a black paint camera. I've been around the world with it. The brass is like coming through, and I'm really hard on my equipment. I really use it. I bang it up. I've dropped it. Like, there's like some of the collectors out there that are like, oh, the black paint is in perfect condition and whatever. And matter of fact, what's interesting is I like the M240 more so than I like the M10. I've had the M10. I've had basically every digital reference of a Leica M body, and the M240 is like my go-to camera. So for digital, I'm shooting a Leica M240. One of the things that I really like about the M bodies and the reason for Leica is not just because of the marquee brand name, but I like that you can find a lens from like the 60s or the 70s and incorporate that into a modern M body. So the glass coatings and aspherical versus non-aspherical lenses change the way that like I'm shooting and kind of capturing moments for myself and for like our social media and stuff. So one of the reasons why I like Leica, whether it's film or whether it's digital, is because there's a universal adaptation for those lenses out of an era to create a specific feel, and that's why I like Leica. I've also been really getting into like Super 8 film. So I've been shooting with a Braun Nizo S56, and I've been shooting and capturing like motion film, essentially, like film, like motion picture, with like a Braun Nizo S56, which is a design icon in itself. But I've been shooting Super 8 film for some of like our Instagram and YouTube stuff, and people are like, "Oh, like that's cool that you're using that Super 8 filter," and I'm like, "Oh no, that's actual real Super 8." Like I'm actually developing Super 8 film, and so I've been shooting with that. I have this really cool little like it's a Rolly 35. So I'm good friends with a guy by the name of Bellamy, and Bellamy has a really cool Instagram called Japan Camera Hunter, and so Bellamy kind of turned me onto this.
Yes, I've seen that account.
Yeah, Bellamy turned me onto this like Rolly 35, which is like this little like pocket size point and shoot 35 millimeter camera. And they're not really expensive, but like it uses this Carl Zeiss lens that is like incredible. And so the rendering of the photos, it's like really easy to use. And so I've been kind of shooting with that kind of stuff. So that's kind of
love it
for the camera stuff.
Love it. Good recommendations for cameras, and we'll link up your YouTube channel as well.
Oh, cool! Yeah.
Again, Felix is going to have a great time referencing all of these bits and pieces. The Rolly 35s are really popular at the moment, and yeah, awesome. Felix, over to you for some
yeah, sure. So, as is traditional on this podcast and others, what have you been doing to pass the time when you're not, hunting down rare references at 3 a.m?
Yeah, no doubt. That definitely takes up a lot of time, and it's something that is kind of. It was funny. I was talking with a friend the other day. He's like, "Well, how do you? You're like kind of nonstop?" And I think that this for me is definitely a lifestyle, and it's that for me in the truest sense. So it's kind of a way of living for me, I guess, more so than it is just a job.
Sure.
And I think, as you guys have pointed to, it kind of comes out in our curated collection and kind of in the social media and stuff like that. But one thing that I'm really into is definitely cars. I'm a big, petrol guy. I love, air-cooled Porsche 911s. That's a passion of mine that I really love. And so I like driving. Being in Los Angeles and in California, there's some really good roads to drive. And so one thing I do to clear my head is I get into the car. I just had a 75 Porsche 911S that just had a hot rod motor put into it with a really good friend of mine who's kind of like a mad scientist. So when it comes to Porsche motors, his name is Marco Grace out of TLG Porsche here in
yeah. TLG Auto, right?
Yeah. And Marco's a watch
He's
guy.
a watch guy too, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So I just got that car back
Seen him
after
around.
it was in the shop for about 6 months, and so I've been, burning through a few sets of tires on that car. So I do that, and then the other thing that I'm like really into is like hi-fi records. So I listen to a lot of records, and I like that kind of collecting element of like finding records online. And before the pandemic, I was going into like record stores in my travels and looking for specific records, and I like old like tube amplifiers and turntables and that kind of stuff. And so that's a thing that I've been kind of doing in my spare time to kind of unwind and
cool.
hang. So
Amazing. Well, Cam, thank you so much for joining the show. Guys, go check out craftandtailor.com to see the interesting range and great range of watches that Cam sells, and obviously at Craft and Tailored on Instagram. We'll link everything up. But yeah, thank you so much. Great to have you, and stay safe.
Yeah,
you
great
too.
to
Thanks
chat,
so much, Andy and Felix, for having me, and always here and happy to help. So I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Andy Green, thank you for introducing me to Cameron from Craft and Tailored. He is a gentleman and a horological scholar, as they say.
Lovely guy.
Yeah, that was great. That's all we've got time for today. What do we need to do before we go, Andy?
Thank you, our sponsors. Thank you, Longines. So make sure you check out the new Spirit Collection.
Yep.
We'll link everything up. Thank you to our coffee sponsor, Inglewood Coffee Roasters.
Have yourself a cup of Yoga Chef while you're checking out the new Longines Spirit Collection.
The cheekiest cup. Don't forget to use OT30 for 30% off at checkout.
Nice.
Thank you to Magiton Media for pulling this all together.
And thank you guys for following us at Instagram. That's ot.podcast, and occasionally emailing us at otthepodcast@gmail.com. Of course, thank you also for all leaving 5-star reviews on your podcaster of choice and listening every week. We'll see you next time.
We still have only ever had 5 stars, so thank you guys.
Well, don't say that. They're all stuck going to go.
I'll cut this.
I'll show you 1 star.